Okay. Let's see. We are recording, and I probably need to figure out how I want to start this. Hey, Garrick, how you doing, buddy?
Good, man. How are you doing? How's Sweden? Cold?
Dude, yeah, unfortunately, the clouds set in today. It's been sunny for the last couple of days. This is the time of year when it can either be so cold you need to put back on a winter jacket, or you wear shorts.
Yeah.
It's one of the two.
Yeah, I think it's Europe. I mean, Spain. You can still get pretty chilly weather in April or May. The whole continent is pretty far north.
Yeah, that's true.
It's chilly.
That's true. But when you think of Spain, you usually think of kind of dry, hot weather. But I guess where you live, you guys actually get pretty cool weather as well.
Yeah, we get cold weather, but it's probably a little bit like Texas. You know, you can have some very cold winters sometimes, but you can also have very warm winters, and then you got kind of a changing, rotating. From one day to the next, it can be different. But summer,
I grew up in Houston, right? We didn't get cold winters.
Oh, that's right, you did. Yeah, I was talking more Panhandle, West Texas. Yeah. Northern Texas, where you would get, that's right, Houston. I know our friends who showed up to Dallas for college and from Houston, they didn't have coats. They just had like a jacket, and it got really cold, and they were like, "Hey, where's your coat?" And like, "I don't have a coat."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, completely different worlds.
Yeah. Very different. But it doesn't get too hot here till like July and August. Really, you can still be in a jacket in June in Spain. Like, you'll get some nice days, but it's July and August, and it's brutal.
Just yet another reason to live in Europe. You know, much better weather than, let's say, the Texas Panhandle. No offense to the Texas Panhandle.
No offense.
May God bless it and its barbecue.
It's a great place.
And its people.
People are amazing.
But the weather leaves something to be lacking. Yeah. One of the greatest songs ever, maybe a slight understatement, but a song I like, Robert Earl Keen Jr., Level Land.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's about. Yeah. Also, Amarillo Highway. Although he didn't write Amarillo Highway, that's right. What's his name? Terry Allen. Terry Allen wrote Amarillo Highway, but Robert Earl Keen sings. So he's a lot of songs out there.
I love the Level Land song. So flat, makes you wonder why they stopped there. Must have had a wagon that broke down or lacked ambition.
Yeah.
I forget exactly how it goes. So anyway, that's a loose translation.
Yeah,
hey, so you guys got to go outside yesterday.
First time since I think like March 13th, we were able to go outside with kids. For non travel to the hospital or the doctors or to the grocery store. So yes.
So in Sweden, there's a great tradition of it's called kusläpp, which cow release.
Cow release.
The releasing of the cows.
Yes.
And so it's when you let the cows go for the first time out into the field after being cooped up all winter.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
And they literally, you've never seen so much joy on an animal. They jump all the way out in the field, and they're just so excited they can't.
Wow,
so
interesting.
It's actually become this really cool tradition in Sweden that local dairy farmers will throw this big festivities thing, and you come out, all the city folk come out and they grill hamburgers, and which is a very ironic meal to have out of anyway. I guess you got to get rid of those old dairy cows somehow. So anyway, But so we go to it every year, and I had this sense yesterday when I heard that y'all got to go outside. I had this sense that everyone in Spain was like the cows being released once they got fresh air.
Yes, they compared it to Three Kings Day, which is like the big day in Christmas.
Yeah.
And you get gifts, and you go out, and there's a big parade, and it's like the kids' day. So they compared it to that in the local newspapers. So. It was, I think, for a lot of people, it's a sense of the end is in sight. Things are getting better, little by little.
Yeah,
we're getting back to normality. So yeah.
Oh, don't go back to normality. You got to pivot, my friend.
I'm pivoting to try to find a good vacation deal. Is going to be my pivot. I need to go somewhere and relax a little.
That's a not necessarily that phrase, because during this time there was a need to pivot and everything else. But you and I both read an article today. You actually sent it to me, the Carey Nieuwhof article, and it was provoking for you. Nothing against Carey Nieuwhof. I think some of his stuff that I've read and listened to over the years has been really good. I think he's a good leader. The article left something lacking, but it kind of talked about you gotta, this is the new normal and everything. And of course, you and I have already done a whole podcast on is everything going to be the same, or is it going to be different? Have you changed your mind on that? Do we need to set in for the permanent change?
I don't think so. I read another article which is written by a friend of mine. It's in Christianity Today. A guy named Marcos Zapata from Lugo, a small town in Galicia, and he actually got it and almost apparently was quite sick. Wow. He did contemplate the end of his life while he had coronavirus. It was pretty serious, but he got through it, got over it, and so he had like kind of 6 things he said were what the church needs to be focused on for after this. And they were pretty much, serve people. People need help right now. Mourn with people. People are going through, bad times. People have lost family members, friends, or they've lost things. They've lost graduation. They've lost the future. We need to be there to mourn with people. He talked about community. He talked about we need to be humble. He talked about these things that as leaders, I think it's easy in the kind of the business mindset of like, well, we gotta figure things out. Whereas he's saying no. I think what he's saying no. We go back to what the church has always been, and that's what's gonna we need to step up and do those things.
Do you think, cheeky question, do you think we know what the church has always been?
That's a very dangerous question. Well, I think we know the core values of.
Are you a home church guy? I'm just kidding.
I think we know the core values of what Jesus, called us to do, which is, serve the least, cry, weep with those who are weeping, build community, love people, share the gospel, tell people the good news. So that's why I think when I hear all the, I think there certainly could be strategies and things we need to do. We need to be online. We need to be doing those things, obviously. But at the end of the day, the core of who we are, love God, love your neighbor, has not changed in 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And so, we can try to reverse engineer or future engineer some kind of amazing thing. And some of that's really good stuff. I'm not saying it's not. But when it comes down to it, the people of God are going to be the people of God, and we have to go back to the core values of what Jesus did, how he lived his life. And
so, I would agree with that. I would, the idea of mission and telling people about the good news of the once and coming King, I think is a huge central piece of that. Making disciples as we go along and fulfilling the Great Commission as an act of obedience in every moment, rather than a certain amount of water to be filled or to be put into a bucket. Those are two different ideas. So I agree with you. I'm on board with you. Mm-hmm. And I only ask the question as a cheeky question to kind of, because there's always those people out there that goes, well, what's the church always done? And there's a lot of people out there today who you kind of, I don't want to say you land in one of two camps. I know a lot of people who question the current, church that we have. And I use the word church loosely, but I would say the Christianity as a whole, kind of like, no, we've lost our way. We need to go back to, and then pick your camp, right? It could be the Anabaptists, it could be the Moravians, it could be the Brethren, it could be Catholic, it could be Orthodox, it could be, you literally pick your pants. Pick your pants. Yes. One should always pick their pants.
Or have someone pick them.
Or have someone pick their pants for them. Hopefully someone who is not colorblind. Anyway, Jewish roots movement. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but everyone's got their thing that they want to go back to. So you and I have both been reading Stefan Pass, and it's really interesting to me. So I'm on a second book of his called Pilgrims and Priests. And so far, it's like the guy's been in my head for the last 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
The things that he describes or that he has gone through, I think, would be my experience in Sweden to a large measure. There's always differences. You know, he's been in the Netherlands. Sweden and the Netherlands have a lot of overlap, but not
Yeah.
necessarily the same thing. But anyway, all that to say, he talks a lot about church planting and the need for churches and the need for doing this in difficult soil. I've really been wondering lately if what I would say is in general in Europe, at least with the people that I talk to, and so this would be, agape people, crew people, some missionaries outside of that, and in general churches in Sweden. Okay, so I'm somewhat limited, but have a general overview. And everyone knows that something's amiss, right? Everyone knows we're everyone has in their idea kind of what in their head an idea of what they would quote unquote like to see happen. And whatever that might be, we're not necessarily seeing it, right?
Yeah.
So churches are empty. In many cases, churches are being converted into, skate parks, nightclubs, restaurants, whatever. In some cases,
it's very true.
Yeah, and so people say, okay, the church is dying or Christianity is dead, all these different things. So everyone knows that something is amiss, but insofar as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be an identification of what the problem is, at least agreement on what the problem is. Do you have a sense? Am I wrong on that, or would you agree with that statement that people aren't necessarily, or at least the people I know, there isn't much agreement on what the problem is?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. So what we're I think historically, so it's a little bit we're out of context. I think as a people of God, in that historically we are in a time period that has seen, in some sense, maybe you can say the fulfilling of the Great Commission or coming very close to it, in the sense that there are very few places in the world where there is not a church. There are actually very few places in the world where the church is not experienced in the last 100 years incredible growth. South America, Africa, Asia, in the gospel has, for lack of a better word, it has worked. It has gone around the world. It has raised up indigenous churches of all kinds. So you're seeing that, and that's kind of becoming, I think, in most cases, in most places in the world, the standard idea, right? Go to India, do this, boom. We've got 3 or 4 new churches within a year. Now, look, and what that's messy still. I'm not saying that that's perfect models or whatever, but what you're seeing is growth generally. If not in the university setting, then in the slum setting. If not in the slum setting, then among government people. So what we're seeing in Europe is not that. So it's something totally different. The problem is I think what Potts brings in is that what we bring in from the U.S. or from South America, and what is our mental image, how ministry, how mission works. The assumption is that's just going to dump it into Europe and it'll work.
What do you think that idea that is taken from, by and large, American evangelicalism? Mm-hmm. What is that idea that we're trying to take? Well, American evangelicalism, and probably Poss would seem to argue a connection to Anabaptist movements of long ago. Mm-hmm. How would you define this is what people are assuming that we should be seeing, or that we would hope to see, right? Where maybe the one way to put it is, what is their success criteria?
Yeah. I mean, I think numbers is a big thing. And I think he points us to, and you and I have talked about this a lot, is like the modernist world we live in, which has said you can engineer your future, you can engineer success, right? If you do enough of this strategy or enough of this, whatever it is, X, it will produce we can control that. And so that had very much imbibed into American missionary and church planning thinking, and then which then got filtered out into other cultures as well as they saw growth and well then okay if you do this, and then everyone brought their own their own flavors. So then I think that's all good stuff. I don't want to criticize that necessarily. It got us from zero to where we are now, effectively.
Right.
But but the problem is it has its downside too, and it has its weaknesses. Everything does. But what now is you're seeing those exposed even more so, even within our own organizations. What do you do to reach students in Western Europe? Well, what we do here is in all these other contexts, which kind of works pretty good. It's not working here. We just have to be honest. It's not that it's not devoid of value or it's not devoid of functioning at some level, but it's not doing what people want it to do. So that is I think the big question. Part of that is because we've come at it with a cultural assumptions ourselves and societal assumptions that we think which once again not bad, but that there's more to it than that. And I think, not to belabor the point, but if you go back to the older, the early church, I don't think they weren't necessarily talking about strategies and we can figure this out. They were just trusting in God and going. And then 200 years, sometimes they didn't see. They were a lot of them were getting killed.
Right,
I don't think that's not what we would say is success.
Poss makes the point that in Corinth, that there was one house church, of this massive city, and there are a small number of people, and it's important to remember that what obviously, well, maybe not obviously, I don't know if Paul would have, but certainly Paul would have preferred to have more numbers in a place like Corinth. I assume that he would have wanted that, but he doesn't, since he wouldn't have considered Corinth a non-success or a failure simply because it had 40 to 50 people.
Yeah.
The mission of the church was to keep going. So I think one of the things that is always this tension that I think we've got to hold is, or at least this is where I struggle oftentimes, is where there's three things that kind of come up. There is this sense of, okay, there are, for lack of a better way of saying it, there are methods and modes of engineering or principalizing that we want to take and learn from and apply, right?
Yeah.
So if in general do this, you see a modicum of success. Like, so when we say people are relational, that's a principle statement. It's in general, this is a statement about people and the way they work. And then that guides kind of what we do or how we talk to people, right? We want to create opportunity for relationship to blossom. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then there's the tension of, okay, well, what is me being wise? So I read or hear a person in Manila who has created this really great opportunity for relationship in, we created this event, or we did this, or we're using this app or whatever else. Mm-hmm. And so there's the tendency for me to want to go, well, I want to be wise with my time. I want to do what works. So I'll try that, adapt it to my Swedish setting and see what happens.
Yeah. And
it does or it doesn't work. So sometimes, I'll be honest, I can feel the tension of, well, is that wise for me I want to be wise, so I want to have a good idea. And so I want to listen to people and what they're doing, and maybe even I could try it, best practices, so to speak. But then there's the tension of, yeah, but that doesn't always work. And
yeah,
I hate being the refrain of, I think one of the difficulties of being a missionary in a place like Europe, I think that there are other places in the world that are like Europe, in the sense that what works somewhere doesn't always work there.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, but oftentimes I can't tell you how many times I almost feel guilty when I say it, because Sweden is every place is unique, but Sweden is a very odd place. It's a very unique place. And so I can't tell you how many times I've been talking to someone and they would say something like, well, have you tried X or something? And my first thought is, Sweden's different. You know,
Yeah.
I don't, I sound cynical when I say it, but it just seems different. And so there's that tension, right? There's that tension of here's a best practice. And it's like, well, yeah, but people aren't necessarily responding to that.
Yeah. Well, I think too, there's an element of there in that as Christians, and as, like I said, as Christians who've experienced missions and church growth in our situation in the United States, where we're coming from over the last 100 years, there's a lot of reasons to be positive, optimistic, hopeful. So we want things to work. We hear that something worked there. That may be the thing, but that's coming with an American mentality that we can. There's a code to be unlocked. Number one,
right?
And then I think a good part of that, which is hope. We want to see good things happen. I think that's what's really. So I feel some way. Sometimes I tell people, but this is not going to work in Spain, and you kind of get this. Oh well, yeah, you're probably doing it wrong, or you probably don't know what you're talking about, or and so you're kind of stuck between those two worlds. And I want to stay open and fresh to be able to change, but I also know I can't myself and in my team, I can't keep throwing stuff at them that doesn't work, because they're gonna burn themselves out as well, because they're like, well, here's another. So I think in Europe we get caught in that little bit of a dialectic, that tension, what you're saying.
Yeah. And so it's that really trying to figure out. So I think trying to figure out, well, what do I need to principleize and try? And principles, I think, are good. Engineering movement or growth or whatever else is actually very hard. And I think actually probably a bad idea. So principalizing is okay. Like, people are relational. Well, okay, then let's focus on that. But, one of the things that Paz has kind of said is, and this is something I have felt very acutely here in Sweden, and that's he went to Amsterdam and to be a church planner. Mm-hmm. And when he was there, he realized, well, wait a second, all these people have pretty good lives and are pretty happy without Christ. What is the unique, quote unquote, selling point? He didn't use that term. That's my term. But what is the unique selling point of Christ? Now, this isn't a crisis of faith. Mm-hmm. So I'm not offering it as a crisis of faith, but rather, what do you do as a missionary? And this is where I've really thought about this a lot, is what do you do when you walk into a situation? So you walk in and you say, hey, Jesus is here to help your misery. He forgives you from your sin. And someone says, but I'm not miserable.
Yeah.
And then you spend all your time trying to convince someone that they are, in fact, miserable. Or essentially what Paz says is, what he found was people in Amsterdam were experiencing a mode of the kingdom without the king. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think that's what we experience a lot in Europe, is that Europeans, by and large, specifically in the north, where things are a lot more wealthy, but people are living pretty good lives. And to be honest, social justice is actually at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, and they're experiencing some of these things without so they're experiencing a little bit of the kingdom without the king. And I think what's hard with a lot of the ideas of when we think, okay, I'm going to come in there. I mean, I had this idea, right? I mean, the first time I went overseas was, well, I mean, it's not working there yet because I haven't gotten there. It's really what I thought.
Yeah.
And of course I was quickly, that notion was quickly removed from my head. But I think there's the difficulty there of, well, then how do you help people see their need for the king if they feel like they have the kingdom?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the hardest things.
It's a very difficult question, because I think as we see more and more in secular society, the default is not to move towards any type of religious experience or anyone that could be defined. So I think I may have been Paz. I can't remember or it could be Taylor, but it's kind of a definition of secularism of people realizing they could leave faith and leave the church, and it didn't affect them negatively at all.
Yeah.
It made no difference in their life, and that obviously says a lot about I think a deeper question, which you might get into, was really how Christian was Europe to begin with. Obviously it had a Christian culture. Obviously there were many believers, people who really followed Jesus, but how Christian was it when people were able to make that shift so quickly and so easily? And so maybe, I think even Potts mentioned it, talking about how Luther, Calvin, even going back to early popes, they all had written about how we understand not everyone here is a Christian. Just because you're a member of a church does not make you a follower of Jesus. So there was an understanding of that for a long time. And then there's a whole other discussion there about what's a Christian society, and is that really what we're needing to do and build up, or is it to just simply be faithful and trust that God? I think that's oftentimes in modern thinking we've left out the Holy Spirit and God, as far as like God builds movements, God builds His church, God builds the kingdom. We are here in our time to be a part of that, but that does not necessarily necessitate that we will have success or what we think is success. That there was going to be mass movements, which I think the mass movement thing is going to generally be in the long march of 2,000 years of church history. I think it's the exception, maybe. Yeah. I don't know. That would be another question to go into.
I think it's a statistical aberration. So here's where I'm at right now. In some sense, it feels like there's a parallel to this in America, but it feels like we maybe some people have woken up to this, maybe some people haven't. But Europe has left Christendom. So Christendom is dead. In some sense, what Christendom did was it subsidized the Christian faith. So if you think of the airline industry or whatever else, in Europe and in America as well, those were subsidized for long periods of time. But
if I'm not correct, wasn't it almost automatic for many years in Sweden that, and maybe still to some degree is, that when you were born, you just automatically became a member of you were automatic. That's just something you got, like a passport, right, and a membership in the Swedish church,
right.
And so
right. Yeah. So who actually were, and this becomes a definition of how do you want to define I realize that we have people who listen who are from all sorts of faith and or all sorts of the spectrum of the Christian faith, but how do you want to define who is a believer and everything else? But yeah, so how do you get that? So Christianity was in some sense subsidized, but it wasn't just members of the church. It was schools taught religious courses and educated people, and so it was subsidized, right? So your whole society had a familiarity with the Christian faith. A level of familiarity. Well, that subsidy is gone now. Yeah. There is some education, and in some senses, some countries are by and large still Catholic. Italy, Spain, but I would still argue the subsidy itself is gone. But I'm not sure that I'm not sure that I, as a missionary, and I'm not sure necessarily that there are many Christians who realize that subsidy's gone. And so what you then have is you have a culture war that ends up happening because Christians, and so I think this is in some sense what you have happening in the US right now, where the subsidy of just familiarity with the Christian worldview has disappeared. And you have the happy pagan, the happy agnostic secularist showing up and going, I don't need God, I don't want God. And so by and large, the society is removed from that. And so what ends up happening is Christians who once had some kind of position of power within society think we're losing that. And rightfully so, they're losing that power, or they're losing that position, the influence, and the perception that we're a Christian society. And so then you go into panic, but you still have this thought of an idealized Christendom in which so many people were believers. But even, like you said, even Luther and popes and different people recognize, it's probably only around 5-10%. I mean, a lot of the Dutch reformers, right? This is what Poss brings up. It's like 5-10% maybe. So not all that far from where we are today. In Sweden, we're about 1-2%. So it's 5 or 6 times more. But I think it's interesting that we find ourselves in that position. So misidentifying what the problem is. So I think when I first came to Sweden, I thought what people need is an awakening. We need an awakening of people to the Christian message. But I actually think that it's not possible to awaken people to something that they're dead to. So I'm not saying that we would never see numbers in Europe. I pray that we do see numbers, but I'm not sure that we need to see an awakening, because that assumes a certain amount of once being awake, right? You've fallen asleep, but now you need to be awake to it. And I actually don't think that in where we are today that you face that. Paz says, I'm going to actually read part of this in his book, Pilgrims and Priests. He says, you face a decreasing demand, speaking of people's interest in the Christian message. Regardless of how inventively or creatively you wrap it, there are many people who simply do not find the product all that interesting. My impression is that mission-minded people often do not really dwell on this. But in Amsterdam, this reality will hit you inevitably. We had come to Amsterdam to contribute to mission in that city, to try to plant new churches. And while we did that, I soon noticed that all dreams about mass conversions were based on thin air. While Christianity certainly continues to prove itself as a vital life option to some people, sometimes with high-profile conversion stories by leading authors and thinkers, these stories are a far cry from so-called people movement. Rather than a continuing stream, we saw drops here and there, beautiful drops to be sure. I entered that typical faith crisis that comes with a radical change in life. Only if you become a real minority will you find out how much your faith is intertwined with your social context, how much it depends on plausibility structures that affirm this faith. You ask yourself the question, what it actually means to trust in God, to believe in Jesus and his kingdom, when virtually nobody shares this faith or is even vaguely interested in it. You start to wonder whether it is really worth your time to invest so much in one seeker who knocks on the front door while so many others leave through the back. These questions hit you with double strength when you notice that people can really be happy without religion, and that they do not need God either to care deeply about their fellow humans or to give charity. In most of them, you do not find this sense of emptiness or the vague sense of guilt that can be found among non-believers or ex-churchgoers in a more religious area. In Amsterdam, faith has nothing to do with doing the decent thing or following tradition. If you want to go to religion, you are absolutely free to do as you like, but it is purely a matter of individual appeal. And this appears to happen only to a few. I mean, it's like he has summed up my 12 years of life in Sweden. And it's profound.
Yeah. He's thought about this a lot, and obviously he's a professor of missiology in Holland, in the Low Countries. So he's in a place where I think there's a good balance between that there is church and there's stuff going on, but then there's this history behind it, and then there's this creeping secularism that's, we're not really sure where all that goes. And so I think what he's being very interesting in he's trying to call people to is an awareness of what's really going on, but in that awareness to maybe to pivot to faithfulness. I think to pivot to we don't give up, which I think some people would give up. We don't try to figure out what, although I think we need to be ready for change someday, because that could happen, but we need to be faithful and present and look for those beautiful, what is it called? Beautiful drops.
Yeah. So it's not a flood of people, but there are beautiful drops.
Yeah. But the beautiful drops, and people's lives are being changed, and we have to be present and work through theologically and reflectively what all this means, which can't be done, I don't think, in the course of a month or a short training. I think it's kind of a, but once again, we get back to that very quick. We need answers. We need solutions. We need numbers.
And we have a narrative that we've told ourselves that if it's successful, if it's good, if it's right, it will produce a flood of people or at least momentum in a certain
Yeah.
direction. So, but it's interesting because when you read the New Testament,
Yeah.
recently we were reading Hebrews for something, and I know what it was. It was on European meetings. We had the director in Ireland lead our devotional times, and he was reading from Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Fame of Faith, 11 and 12. And you have this cloud of witnesses, right? Well, the Hall of Fame of Faith is there to encourage a very small minority of people who are facing the overwhelming odds that say, leave your faith.
Yeah.
It's easier to do this over here. And it occurred to me when he was reading that the person who's in a stadium filled with people doesn't need to hear that message, because there's every reason to keep doing what they're doing. When everyone else is doing it, you just go along with it. It's to the people who are very few, who are on the minority of society, who find themselves in such an extreme low number of people whose faith is tested, and whose faith, I don't want to say endures, but it becomes solid gold in some sense. And so, I'll be honest, when Pa says, he says later, he says, it's not until you're in exile that you realize it's not until you're in exile that your faith gets tested and proven to the point that you really begin to understand its worth. And that's actually one of the really cool opportunities that I think we have as Christians in Europe, among the community of believers that we are, to really emphasize you're not coming to church because you don't have anything better to do.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a social club, there's a good football team down the street, or there's the underwater basket weavers of Northern Uppland. I mean, there's whatever you want it to be. There's all those opportunities. You don't need to come to Jesus for just self-fulfillment or a program to fulfill your life. You're not looking to your church for that. You're looking to your church for life.
Yeah.
And, I've met a lot of people whose faith is different from mine, but I would say who cling to Christ in a way that I understood before I came, because I was very fortunate to live in contexts where I felt a minority.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But I would say this, in those contexts, I was a Westerner in a developing country where being an American was a rock star.
Yeah.
And so I always felt, even though I felt like, well, everyone else sees things differently, if I'm honest in my heart of hearts, I looked at it and I was kind of like, well, that's because, they're them, but I'm awesome because I'm from Texas, or I'm American. It just never sat the same way. But it wasn't until I got to Sweden where people were like, I don't really care where you're from. I think what you believe in is stupid, that it was kind of like, okay, my faith needs to kind of come down to what's the essential parts. Yeah. And over the last few years, the idea of the once and returning king has become so important to me. It's what I cling to, because it's like, man, I am looking for that kingdom. It is so that picture of the cloud of witnesses standing up there going, hey, we endured, you need to endure. Trust me, it's worth the wait, has become all the more important to me.
Yeah.
But I think you miss that if you're fighting the culture war, or if you're trying to latch on to a sense of revival that maybe isn't what we need to be looking for.
Yeah, I think I think what you said there's of exile, which kind of pulls us back into pilgrimage at some point. And I think pilgrimage is such an important part of Christian life, because we are really called to be exiles in this world, and but oftentimes, and I like, once again, I don't want to criticize the fact that America has had a great boom in church growth. That's a great thing. That's made huge benefits. It's done great things for the gospel. And you build hospitals. You have great organizations that are saving people's lives. That thing, is a great thing. But the downside of that, I think, as you said, is this creation of a culture where many things are a little bit too easy, or where that's just the norm. and so we lose that sense of what God calls us to, which is to be an exile.
Yeah.
To be, this is not our home. It doesn't mean we can't love Texas.
Yeah.
Texas is a great place. We should love our people and our home and our land, but it means we're not really from here. I mean, maybe we're all going to Texas eventually. I don't know, but we're not really
what's
from
Texas. What's that song? If when I die, I may not go to heaven. Just let me go to Texas.
Just let me go to Texas.
Texas is as close as I've been.
Yeah. So you have out of this grows, and so Apostle is interesting because he's kind of post-missional, right? The missional movement, which I think was a great movement, and I think he's somewhat not totally critical of it, but he's certainly, I think, pushing back on some of the things there. But when the whole missional thing that came out, some great thinkers in the 80s, 90s, and recently, they're latching onto that. Things have changed. We can't be the church like we used to be. And they use a term called liminality, right? Which means liminal is a liminal situation, which actually is a term that comes from cultural anthropology and is used in pilgrimage, actually. So we're trying to tie back.
Okay, so I want you to hold that thought. Every time we bring up pilgrimage, I think of the which I'm all for. I love the idea. It's been really important in my life for the last year or so. But are you familiar with the comedian Brian Regan?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so he's got a bit where he's talking about, I even forget what the bit is, but he starts talking about the guy who the salesman who sells cranberry. This is a number of years ago, and he's like, man, that guy's having a heck of a year. He's like, I got cranberry. What you got? Pork chops? Call them cran chops. He's like, what do you got? Orange juice? Call it, cranberry and orange juice, like cran juice.
It was like cran apple.
Yeah. He's like, what's the deal with cranberries getting in everything?
Yeah, I remember that ocean spray. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's how we are with pilgrimage. Like it's kind of like, you got a problem? Hey, let me talk about pilgrimage.
But it's kind of how we got this whole thing going.
It is, which is great. When you have hundreds of kilometers to walk on the Camino de Santiago, eventually you're going to say, let's start a podcast and talk about it.
Yeah. I spent too much time up there. That's for sure. But so liminality, right? Is this, it's leaving safety, what's comfortable, and going into a time of confusion, uncertainty, chaos, but you emerge on the other side. And so as humans, we all go through liminality in our lives, right? You go to college, that's a big change, but the goal is you emerge on the other side, changed, deeper, and prepared for the next challenge ahead. And so I think what I would say is, and that's a term that got used a lot in missional terminology, was the church needs to go through this liminal experience to then come out and be something better, And I think some churches have done that. But I think what we're seeing in Europe, I think we're kind of the laboratory for that. We are in a liminal. We do not, and obviously the early church would be a laboratory for this.
Right.
What are we doing with this? We had this guy. He was here. He died for us. He rose again. He's kind of left us on our own. What
inside of me?
What are we supposed to do with this? Like, it had to be a very very strange experience. And so I think in some sense, Christians in Western Europe maybe are dealing with some of that as well. But I think, what I would say is that's probably a positive, because we can now emerge at some point on the other side, or maybe we have emerged, or we're emerging, but we're growing as a church. I think within that, there's some very interesting things that are happening in Europe.
I think there's fascinating things.
Groundbreaking as far as how we do mission and how we conceive ourselves. And so we have we have a lot to learn from South American Christianity. We have a lot to learn from African Christianity. We have a lot to learn from even our friends in America and Asia, everywhere. But I think in Europe, there's something going on that I don't know has ever happened before in the history of the church, which is a collapse of the church.
Well, you had it in North Africa. I mean, Tunisia, right? So I've been to.
Would it have been? Was it a violent collapse though, or because I know this collapse.
Yeah, I don't know.
This is just people like, I'm out.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to Tertullian's church where he did baptisms, which is one of the coolest places I've ever been. I bet. It was, and Carthage is so cool the way they would do it. So it was or at least where I went, it was underground, but the person would come down, so everyone would be down in the base, and the person would come in from behind them and walk in with black robes, and they would walk down into the water, but the baptismal was behind a wall. So they would walk down into the water, and then they would come out and they would have white robes.
Oh, that's so cool.
And so they would have, it was this beautiful transition into kind of, what the idea of being baptized in Christ does for you. Yeah. So I don't know. A buddy of mine, Michael Meditol, he's looked at kind of the collapse of the church around the world. And what he would say is, or not the collapse, but in situations where the church existed and now doesn't at present exist, what he would say is where the church eventually dwindles to a certain point, basically we haven't seen a situation in which it comes back. So he would offer, I think, probably Turkey, North Africa as examples of this. Now, that by and large was due to Islam and the killing of Christians, or just the freezing them out of society. And that isn't happening in Europe. But I would agree with you that we are the laboratories of rethinking and trying things and looking at things if we're aware of it. Sometimes I fear that some leaders aren't aware of it and they're just hoping for the next great revival. And there's nothing wrong with numbers. There's nothing wrong with revivals. And I pray every day that we would see one in Sweden. But I think that we can put our hope in, okay, well, maybe if I could just find the next great method, or maybe if I could find, instead of saying, well, no, I'm on this journey, or I'm on this pilgrimage, and it is what it is, and it will be sweet, whatever it is. Yeah. I think that sometimes we get confused by the pursuit of numbers in order to justify ourselves versus saying, are we remaining faithful to what he's called us to? Yeah. So the exercise for the missionary or the exercise for the Christian doesn't change. It's still, no, I make Jesus known in everything that I do. But I don't think that there should be a sense of loss if in the exercise of making Jesus known, no one responds. I mean, we mourn that. I think there's a difference between mourning and feeling unsuccessful. And as an American, I'm driven to try to find success, right?
We went numbers. Well, and so, okay, so here's you have the parable of the lost sheep, the shepherd who leaves the many to go for the one. And you have consistently in the New Testament, and probably you can play it out in the Old Testament as well, but you have the elevation of the small, the tiny.
Israel, for example, the tiny, not really worth it.
Why would you pick Israel there? Yeah. But that God uses the small things, that God goes after. His love is so amazing that he even goes after the one little guy out there who's probably not that important. And I think those clash with a lot of our models of how we think about ministry, at least in the United States, where we do want to have, and once again, numbers are great, influential people are great, but that's part of the history of the gospel. But the last will be first. Yeah, is and so I think in Europe you have to learn that the last is first. That these, the strange people who are showing up at your door are, those are who you're called to sometimes, or that's not always how it works, but you know what I mean?
I don't know, man. We've had our share of pretty strange people come through our doors.
And so I think you look at that, and I think that it helps us maybe focus a little bit, bring a little bit of that perspective. And I think too, you're dead on about numbers. And so I wonder if we really are we really measuring the right stuff when it comes to missions. It's great to have numbers. Obviously, it's fundraising. It helps people get excited about things, and it is sometimes that we're seeing God do great things, and you want to be a part of that. But we're still supposed to go after the little guy, right? Maybe that's Europe in this case, and if we play out the metaphor.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting that the drive for. I want to be careful. I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, right? Because I can. Well, I just don't want to paint too broad of a brush. But the drive to see big things,
Yeah.
And that's a really broad brush, so I'm breaking my own rule. But the drive to see big things, if that rules the day, we actually miss out on a lot of things. This just occurred to me, but we miss out on a lot of things like lament.
Yeah.
It's really hard to lament if what you're going is, okay, well, that didn't work. What do we try next?
Yeah.
Because versus I just lament on where society is. And maybe you can do both things at the same time, or there's people within the community of believers who can, right? So maybe some people are called to thinking about the next thing. I don't know. I guess I would need to think that through. But I do think that it's possible. That's maybe a better way to say it. It's possible we miss out on things important to the walk of the Christian, to the Christian life, if we allow our perception to be some form of Christendom, or some form of just numbers. We cheapen it to some extent, or it's possible to cheapen it. I don't know. This is literally me verbal processing today. You're getting, I'm changing my mind in between my sentences.
I think too, you miss out on the individualization of people's stories and who people are in a relationship. Once again, I know that's not the intention, but when you want to have the 10,000 or 30,000 foot view where you're saying, look at all this amazing stuff that's happening, you miss out the story of, whoever, I mean, I think one thing that I've really loved about a movement like Alpha is it's very focused on people's stories, very focused on people. It's so they got a bunch of Alpha places. I mean, courses running all over the world. But when I think of the Alphas I've done, I think of people whose lives have been transformed and changed, and went from walking into a place like, I don't want to be here, to in a year they're leading Alpha,
right?
And how that they totally changed their life, or whatever it is. And so I think and it's got to be hard for leaders at that level, because they're not, So I in some sense empathize with them. They're but that's unfortunately the waters we swim in a modernist American world, where we can engineer all this to where it's going to come out perfect.
Right.
But God, you can't engineer God. That's the thing. God's not controllable in that way.
Right. Yeah, and you can't.
Frustratingly so.
That's right. He will not be controlled.
He will not be controlled.
That ultimately is the lesson that God teaches Job, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where were you, Job, when Job learns that lesson? And actually, that, interestingly enough, is I think the lesson of my life right now is my desire for control. Coronavirus, COVID has a way of bringing that out, of like, my world's out of control, or I was supposed to make these decisions and I can't any longer, or, my kids are loud and I want control. There's a certain amount of, we desire control. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, that's the paganist bet, isn't it? It's let me create a pantheon of gods that I worship so that I can control my life. I hedge my bets. And that was, of course, what was unique about the God of Israel, was that he said, I am one. You only have one allegiance, but you owe me all your allegiance. And so there's a catch there, but then he's different. The cool thing about that, though, and I did a talk on this one time, but the great I am, Glenn Kreider actually pointed this out to me again. So there
Glenn Kreider.
Glenn Kreider,
Legend.
making another appearance in the podcast. But when God presents himself to Moses, he says, I am the Lord your God. And then he goes on gracious and kind, and he goes, and that's how he chooses to define himself. God could have chosen to define himself however he wanted, in whatever method and whatever way. And he goes and he says, I'm gracious and kind, and I'm full of loving kindness, and which I'm butchering the verse in Exodus, but that is what God points out. So I tell people all the time, actually, here, because a lot of people are like, well, what kind of the journey that I go on with, the secular happy pagan or happy agnostic, let's call him, Swede, is that, the first question you got to ask is there a God? And if there is a God, is he communicated? And if he has communicated, what did he communicate? And actually, there's a lot of ground to be covered in those, right? So the first question of, is there a God? I mean, that's a discussion in and of itself. But once you start to getting into the idea that, okay, well, I'm going to say that there is a God. God did not necessarily, in all the possible worlds where all the possible gods could have existed, this is a little bit of a philosophical experiment, but God did not have to be kind. God could have actually been exactly how like Dawkins describes him, just mean, spiteful curmudgeon that just wanted to zap people, what people in some sense imagine God to be. But that's actually not the God of the Bible. And he describes himself as something different. In my life, actually, what that produces is a sense of fear, because the first rule of tanks is to know where I stand in relation to that tank. Is he on my team or is he not on my team? Once I decide that he's on my team, I can breathe a sigh of relief. But if he's not on my team, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to God could have been really mean, but he's not. He's loving. Yeah. And that's not who he presents himself to be. And that's why Revelation, of course, is so important. We've gone way far afield on that one, but for me, what that has actually, the human endeavor of trying to control your life.
Yeah.
It comes down to the fact that, well, maybe you do want to try to control your life if you've got a God who is mean and unkind, but we don't have that God.
Yeah. He's
kind and he's good. And he's in control, and he has my best interest in mind. What I find, I'm gonna bring this full circle. What I find is when I get caught on the numbers game, or the sense of when my vision of what I want to see happen is I got to build my kingdom, whatever my kingdom is in my head.
Yeah.
I get really discouraged really quickly. But I have to try to gain control more and more and more. But when the game isn't about the numbers, but it's about faithfulness to a God who is a rewarder. So again, eschatology becomes a part of it. Then I can relax and I can let control go. Because the task isn't just, now I want to get the gospel to as many people as possible, but that's not the end game. The end game is making sure that all people who are willing remain faithful to him. And that to me that's a very tangible difference to me.
Yeah, it's nice how you brought that around. That was well done.
You like that? Well, just
it's very good.
Rabbits rarely run in circles, but sometimes.
Sometimes they do.
Sometimes we do that. Oh man, there's so much to think about though. I'm loving Paz. Absolutely, he is.
I think I would say this: if you're working in Western Europe, you should probably be reading something of his at this point. I think more and more, I'm convinced he's one of the few people out there that's talking about these things. I think and he's got some challenging stuff to say. I don't agree with everything he says. He's got some very challenging and very well thought through, very very Dutch. Look at stuff and really analyze it and sort it out. So I think.
I think if I would go so far as to say is if you're in the Western world, if you're in any context which is becoming increasingly more secular, then you need to really look at this book. And I think that actually applies to some good swaths of Africa and Asia and sure. Places like Singapore. I think I don't know. I think there's a lot of wisdom there, because what he's saying is, look, he's pointing towards, these are the laboratories, these are the places of innovation, or these need to be the places of innovation. We maybe haven't necessarily reached that, but they are there.
So this might be another the next podcast is because we've kind of talked about, oh man, this is hard soil. It's understandable, and I think I've been around long enough to say we're a little bit jaded when someone shows up with, "Ooh, I got the new thing that's going to solve all your problems." Usually we're and if you talk to most Europeans, they kind of I think, what was it, Joe, who was on guest last week, I remember him talking about a pastor in France who basically said, "You need to be here about 10 years before we will take you seriously." So Europeans even have seen enough of this that they're a little bit, I don't know. so starstruck by anything. But it might be interesting to have a conversation about what are the good things that are happening. What are we see? We touched a little bit on that last week too. I think when we talked about immigration, and that you do have this something of an emerging multicultural church. People of God are looking very much like maybe they should. It's things like that. Maybe talk about some examples. So I think another thing I would say is I think that there's a depending on where you are, but there's a greater openness to work across denominational boundaries in certain places, not everywhere.
Yeah.
There's doors that are open.
Well, I mean, you've experienced some of that in Spain, right? With y'all doing stuff, giving training to the Catholic Church lay people on how to share their faith, and
yeah, exactly. We've had doors open just because we are in a declining context where Christianity is not in vogue anymore. We're allies now. We're not enemies. We're not competitors. And I think that's there's obviously things that there's some messiness and things to work through there, but there's great opportunities that are being opened up that we 100 years ago would not be possible at all.
Was the unthinkable. And of course, there's people who get when they hear that, they get pretty upset about that. They
sure.
They want to go make their Luther beer and curse the Pope. So, but I mean, I do agree with you. It really does open up. You're much more willing to tolerate people's difference of opinion or confessional differences.
Yeah.
That's something Pass actually says. He said confessional churches or confessional faiths are not bad. The confessions themselves are not bad. So Augsburg or whatever you want to, Westminster, they're not bad, but they're contextual. So they were written to a time and a place that are trying to confess a certain thing for the context that they were in, and need from time to time to be revisited in order to meet the challenges of the particular context. Mm-hmm. I'm not exactly sure where I land on that, but I found it fascinating as a thought to think, well, how then does that play out where we're at? One thing that I do think that where it does play out is exactly what you said. You're much more willing to kind of go, well, you confess differently, but we're in the same boat, and we're just going to accept that, which I think is a really good thing. You start to appreciate your family for what it is, and the family of believers. Which I think is really important. I know my faith or my appreciation of the church in general has gone up since I've been overseas. I took it for granted when I was younger. I mean, I guess you take everything for granted when you're younger, but all relatively speaking. But like my son takes it for granted that I will get him milk or whatever else. Anyway, when he's hungry, yogurt magically appears from the refrigerator.
Yes.
So, but anyway, so I do think though that's one area that I've grown up for appreciation. And I think when you have the perspective of it's okay that we're a minority, or maybe just getting pushed to the margins of things it doesn't always, but it can produce in you an appreciation for other expressions of faith. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me that even within Agape, we have, like when we get together as Agape Europe, we have a really broad swath of faith.
Yeah, we're a very eclectic group.
Yeah. And rarely do the doctrinal issues come up, at least to me, no one but I don't know why anyone would complain to me.
I don't know. I complain to you.
Well, it's a different type of complaining, my friend.
No, I think it's something that is interesting. I'm interested to see where all that goes. But there's definitely the opportunity to influence and be influenced, and we're not talking about we're all going to join one big church, but to see the task, because the task is enormous in Europe, right? The task of helping people know Jesus. So it does help, because I mean, my national director Nacho Marquez, he came and visited Dallas with us, a few years ago, and we figured where we were staying within within you could within almost walking distance, right? Within driving distance, within a 2-minute drive of where we were, we could count about 15 churches.
Gosh.
And all kinds of different, you had Episcopalian and Anglican, you had Catholic, we had like 2 Episcopalian churches, you had several Presbyterian churches from different, and I think that's great. But what people, sometimes you come to Europe and you're like, okay, well, I got like 2-3 choices tops,
Yeah.
unless I'm starting something myself, which is
right.
Which often you feel like you kind of almost have to create your own church culture, even in campus ministry, just so, because you're like, there's nowhere for anyone to go. So I think that lack of, when you meet someone else who's like, oh, hey, you read the Bible, oh, you follow Jesus, oh, you want to tell people about Jesus, you can't go, well, you have to go, okay, wow, we're all on the same team.
Right.
Back then, in the States, you can kind of pick who your teammates are because there's so many.
Right. Yeah, you can. So interestingly enough, a buddy of mine was talking about all of the. Actually, it was a Dutch friend of mine. Was talking about all the different denominations that are in Dutch, or that are not in Dutch, but in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And and he was saying there are some denominations that are like, it was like the Reformed Church of Western such and such province based upon the disagreement of Article 9-1.72. Like, he was like, it's like basically like, we didn't like the color of the seats.
Yeah.
And so we created our own denomination, which still happens. I mean, that's the reason there's Second Baptist Church in other cities in America. But I just thought it was pretty funny.
It's one of the blessings and the curses of Protestantism, right? It was this ability to go off and contextualize better, but then it was also this to break off and keep breaking off. I think Glenn Kreider, the legend, he one time said, I think between 2 and like 100,000, we've gone wrong. Right? like between 2 churches, 2 denominations, and then like the other 100,000, there's somewhere in there something's not right.
Somewhere we missed the magic number.
Magic number. So But I think that's what, to quote another DTS guy, Scott Harrell, I think he would say, trying to build unity around like Great Commission Christianity, Christianity that's saying we want to step out, we want to tell people about Jesus. That's what we're passionate about. We want to help people know him, but also want to serve people so they experience his love. That's where we can, I think, build unity and work together. Because we're not competing for territory, we're building the kingdom. That's hopefully what will happen, and it is happening.
Yeah. Oh goodness. Let's just pause for a really long time and then not cut it out. Garrick is all, we'll cut that out. I love it on podcasts how they're always like, we'll cut that out. They never do.
They never do. You don't have time. Podcasts
they're as lazy with their editing as I am.
Yeah.
Dude, good chat with you. Have you seen
very good chat?
Have you seen anything good recently that I can watch? Because I am.
Oh my goodness.
We are a little bit in the doldrums of viewing.
Yeah, so I watched the movie with my daughter, Paths of Glory, 1958. Kirk Douglas. It was one of Stanley Kubrick's first movies. It's a very stylized kind of black and white. It's an older movie. Talk about World War I and some stuff that happened in the French army. It was actually not well received in France or like much of Europe and military circles. It's just about corruption of leadership. But it was a fascinating movie and well done, and a lot to talk about and think about. And so Paths of Glory, so this is like a classic movie. I finally saw it. She had to watch it for assignment. So
okay.
It was it was a good movie.
Greatest Wes Anderson film.
Oh man, that's tough. So Rushmore is my favorite. Filmed in Houston.
Yeah.
One is my favorite of his, but all of his. So if you haven't seen Rushmore, go see Rushmore. It's a great movie.
It's a good flick.
It's great.
I saw it years ago in the theater. I'm not sure I had the greatest appreciation for Wes Anderson then. I'm not sure that I was young. I'm not sure that my tastes had matured to what they should have been.
Yeah. Wes Anderson somehow struck a chord with me and a few friends. It was kind of we must have been like his
Target audience.
Target is the few hundred of us in those early days.
Hey, you know what?
Audience.
But let's be honest. If Wes Anderson could make a career out of just a few hundred people, this podcast has a future.
This is a funny Wes Anderson story. What they made Bottle Rocket, and so their first movie, him and Owen Wilson did, and they were screen testing it, and it was just going horribly. People hated the movie. And so it was so bad that when someone would write something good about, because it's a screen test, they just bring in people. When someone wrote something really good about it, they would keep it just because they were they'd lost hope. And so there's probably an analogy here about hope and being persevering in Europe, but they lost hope, and so they'd keep these. And then it was like finally they Bottle Rocket wasn't as successful, but it was a very good movie. And then that kind of launched things for them. And he said it was like 6 or 7 years later at a party, and this girl comes up and she goes, I was at one of your screenings back for Bottle Rocket, and that movie was just amazing. And I loved it. And he goes, I know who you are. He goes, I literally remember, because you were one of like a handful of people who wrote, I remember your comments. I know who you are. Thank you. Like, you kept us going. So,
wow.
But
honestly, that is a great analogy for what it means to do ministry in places like Western Europe. You have
hold on to little things.
Yeah. You celebrate everything that is worthy of celebrating.
Yeah.
You don't get overcritical, and you just go, let's hold on to that. And there's nothing delusional about that, because what we're doing is worth it.
Yeah.
Like, greatest in the kingdom will be the least of these. That ultimately what we're doing is we're doing something for a king, and he decides, what his kingdom is going to look like. But what he wants faithful servants. He wants people who will tell about him in all circumstances. Yeah. And then, because if you don't have that, hold on to hope where hope is, hope onto then I don't know why the New Testament was written.
Yeah.
Because there's not a mega church in the New Testament. No. It's 3,000 people on the first day who came to Christ in Acts, and those people dispersed. And it was the beginning of something, but that goes on to something else that we don't have time to talk about it today. But it is something that I often think about, is the nature of movement. So that we're writing this down. We will do a podcast on the nature of movement, because we tend to think, even when we read books like The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, which is in essence about movement. It is a commercialized movement, but it's movement nonetheless. And he tries to identify types of people who help movement start. Okay. And then business people take that and they say, okay, well, this is how we need to get our product out there, is we need to, in some sense, astroturf movement. Movement is so crazy rare on a grand scale. It's so crazy rare that to be able to plan for it, I'm just not sure you can. That doesn't say we don't principalize what a good movement is or anything else. But anyway, we need to get into that sometime. What exactly? I think this is. Let's just let it be the next one, unless of course we're able to pull off the Grand Camino reunion.
Yeah, that's coming up.
In which case, we'll put that one in first. Yep. But anyway, Garrick, as always, I wish that you and I could enjoy some Spanish tapas or pinchos, depending upon which area of the country you're in, together. I wish we could, enjoy some time. But until that time, you take care of yourself.
Likewise, Barrett.
Always great talking to you, buddy. Catch you on the flip side.
I learned something in the juice aisle, and that is, I don't know what's going on with cranberries, but they're getting in all the other juices. Whoever the salesman is for cranberries does a great job. He's showing up everywhere. Hey, what do you got, apples? Put some cranberries in them. We'll call it cran apple, go 50-50. What do you got, grapes? How about cran grape? What do you got, mangoes? Cran mango. What do you got, pork chops? Cran chops. Why don't you back off, cran man? Why don't you take your sales trophy and have a vacation? He's working too hard. He's making the other fruit guys feel bad, you know? Like the banana guy wakes up, man, I ain't into nothing. Cram man's all coupled up. You gotta get cracking, banana man.